My father's words cut through the anniversary dinner like a knife. You don't need a flight, because you aren't going. 30 guests froze as he laughed, pointing at me while my mother looked away and my sister smirked. Humiliation hung thick in the air, but beneath it, I felt something else. Clarity, a cold awareness of the secrets they'd left within my reach. They thought they controlled me, but what if I held the real power instead? The room was heavy with expectation as my father's gaze pinned me to the floor, the echo of his laughter still lingering in the ornate dining hall. My sister Brittany approached her heels, clicking against the polished hardwood, and thrust a 3-inch thick binder into my chest. The binder was meticulous, every detail for the twins, the dogs, the orchids, even the pool cleaner's schedule. Her voice dripped with faux sweetness as she instructed me each word, designed to humiliate to assert control. 30 people watched, anticipating my outburst, my protest, or my surrender. I remained perfectly still. I smiled, took the binder, and said, "Okay, I understand. Have a wonderful trip." Relief rippled across the room. My father's chest puffed with condescension, certain he had tamed me. But beneath that calm, a quiet storm of anticipation had settled in my chest. This wasn't submission. This was strategy. There's a concept in behavioral psychology called strategic compliance, and I was executing it flawlessly. When trapped with a predator, larger, stronger, and ruthless, the smart response isn't resistance. You don't bare your teeth or lash out. You appear small, harmless, compliant. You let them believe they have total control because arrogance is blinding and overconfidence makes them sloppy. That's exactly what I was doing. By accepting the binder, by nodding to each chore, by thanking them for trusting me, I created the illusion of submission while opening the doors to the very empire they thought they had secured from me. I wasn't agreeing to be a servant. I was gaining unsupervised access to the heart of their operations, the safe haven of their secrets. As my mother listed tasks, watering the orchids, collecting the mail, coordinating the household staff, I nodded with precision, my mind calculating every opportunity, every potential access point. Every command became a vector for control, every expectation a tool I could manipulate. By the time the dinner ended and the guests filtered out, whispering about my supposed grace and composure, my father turned to me with a final admonition. "Don't let me down, Paige." I looked him in the eye and replied, "I won't, Dad. I promise I'll do exactly what needs to be done." He believed he was witnessing obedience. He had no idea that in that moment the balance of power had quietly shifted. For the first time in years, I stood alone in the house, not as a subordinate, but as a silent observer with the keys to their empire literally in my hands. Every look, every gesture, every word of condescension had been anticipated, accounted for, and leveraged. The room expected weakness, drama, submission. What they didn't know was that my calm, calculated compliance was the prelude to complete control. For 5 years, while my family continued their charade of wealth and sophistication, I operated in shadows, the unrecognized architect of their financial survival. To the outside world, and even within the walls of the estate, I appeared as the dependent, the one drifting aimlessly through life, a 32-year-old woman living in the guest cottage, driving an aging sedan, quietly overlooked. My mother called it finding myself, a euphemism for stagnation. My sister Brittany framed me as the family help, a passive presence to be ignored. No one knew the truth. I was the shadow CFO of a sprawling construction empire, the unseen hand. steering the chaos, the silent guardian of their fragile facade. Every morning I rose before dawn, the house still bathed in darkness, and settled at a desk cluttered with spreadsheets, invoices, and the remnants of last-minute financial disasters. Offshore accounts were my daily landscape shell corporations scattered across tax havens, invisible threads connecting bank transfers and corporate entities. I monitored them meticulously, ensuring the paper trail remained invisible, yet logically consistent, correcting errors, covering inconsistencies, and anticipating regulatory scrutiny. Tyler's startups, Brittany's extravagances, and my father's penchant for cutting corners, all of it funneled into potential disasters I had to defuse before the world could see. Every mistake was a ticking bomb, every oversight a potential catastrophe, and every night I worked until 4 a.m., painstakingly constructing pathways that would prevent the empire from collapsing. My role was invisible, but critical. I was the shield and the filter, the one who knew where every discrepancy, every hidden account, every forged document resided. While my family dined, vacationed, and flaunted wealth, I carried the empire's weight quietly on my shoulders. I signed documents as the responsible party, aware that if the house of cards collapsed, it would land squarely on me. The power I wielded was unseen and unacknowledged, yet absolute in its impact. I was not just maintaining order, I was preventing disaster. The duality of my existence created a tension that became second nature. The world thought I was failing, yet every financial thread I tightened was a lifeline for the family's fortune. I moved through this space with surgical precision, balancing trust and suspicion, anticipating every mistake my father might make in his calculations, every misstep in Brittany's indulgences, every reckless investment Tyler proposed. The stress was constant, a low hum of anxiety that never ceased. Yet beneath it, I developed an acute understanding of leverage, vulnerability, and control. Each ledger I balanced, each offshore account I monitored, and each error I corrected became a brick in the foundation of my eventual authority. I learned to read the patterns of greed and arrogance, to predict where shortcuts would fail, and to know which weaknesses could later be exploited. What my family saw as dependence and ineffectiveness was actually an elaborate mask, a necessary invisibility that allowed me to operate without interference. While they believed they controlled the narrative, I had spent years embedding myself into the core of their empire, acquiring knowledge, access, and influence that would later allow me to dictate the terms of justice. In hindsight, every late night, every correction, and every unnoticed triumph was preparing me, not just to preserve the family business, but to reclaim power on my own terms. My perceived failure had been the perfect camouflage for my most important role, the silent architect of their survival, and eventually the executor of their reckoning. It was late one night, the hum of the fluorescent lights in my father's office, blending with the quiet shuffle of papers around me. I was shredding documents he didn't want the state inspectors to see when a notification pinged on his email. The subject line was innocuous, just the page problem, but my pulse quickened as I clicked it open. What I read hit me like a physical blow. My father and Tyler were discussing me as if I were a tool, a disposable asset. "Don't worry about Paige asking for a salary," the message read. "She's too scared to leave and too ugly to get married. She's cheaper than a firm and our perfect free insurance policy. If the feds ever come knocking, we claim she went rogue. She's the perfect sigh." I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just sat in stunned silence, the glow of the monitor casting cold light across the room. In that instant, clarity replaced the years of hope I had invested in earning their respect. They didn't love me. They didn't even like me. I was a human shield, a pawn, a walking insurance policy. That was the moment everything shifted. The role I had accepted, the fixer, the silent problem solver, was no longer enough. I realized that if I wanted justice, if I wanted control, I had to document everything meticulously with no shortcuts, no assumptions. And so I began an audit, quietly, methodically converting my position as their silent operator into a covert investigator. Over the next 3 years, I copied every ledger, every email trail, every bank transfer that hinted at illegality or deceit. Each family dinner, each casual gathering where I appeared compliant and unassuming became a stage for observation. I smiled, I nodded, I played the obedient daughter, all while my digital archive grew with damning precision. Offshore accounts, shell companies, falsified invoices, they all became pieces of a puzzle I was assembling in secret. The world saw a woman living in the guest cottage, performing menial tasks and avoiding attention. Behind closed doors, I was meticulously mapping every financial maneuver, every attempt to hide wealth, and every corner they cut to evade taxes. This was no longer just about keeping the empire afloat. It was about collecting evidence, securing proof that would one day expose the full extent of their deceit. While they believed I was dependent and powerless, I was becoming the one person who knew every flaw, every vulnerability, and every secret. That night, with the monitor's glow reflecting off the paper and the walls of the office, I understood that from fixer I had transformed into auditor, investigator, and witness. The shadow I had been living in became a vantage point of power, one I would wield with precision when the time came. The morning air was still and heavy with expectation as the house stirred awake in a controlled chaos of luxury and entitlement. Brittany was already screaming over a vintage Hermes scarf, tossing silk and cashmere onto the floor as if the room were her personal boutique. Tyler slouched on the bed, sunglasses hiding the remnants of a hangover, the scent of bourbon clinging to him. My mother's voice echoed downstairs, directing the private driver on how to handle her hat boxes, while perfume and panic mingled in the foyer. I moved through it all quietly, slipping past their dramatics toward my father's study. The door closed behind me with a deliberate click, sealing off the world of noise, distraction, and false authority. On the massive oak desk, he tossed a stack of unopened IRS notices like they were mere envelopes of routine correspondence, but I knew better. These were flags, warnings, and potential traps waiting for someone to misstep. He looked at me with a measured coldness, reminding me whose signature was on the returns and framing the threat in the guise of guidance. If the ship sank, I would be its captain. Then came the brass key, heavy and purposeful, the key to the filing cabinet that held everything: the ledgers, the paper trails, the physical evidence they assumed I couldn't comprehend. In that single moment, as he handed me the key, the true weight of responsibility settled on my shoulders. But alongside that weight was clarity. They had left me with the entire mechanism of their empire, blind to the shift in power that had quietly taken place. As they filed out one by one, my father issuing a final condescending command to give him my house key, the black limousine swallowing them into paradise, the front door swung shut behind them. The house, Once a theater of obedience and submission transformed in an instant into a domain where I alone held the knowledge, the keys, and the leverage. Every command they had, barked every chore they assumed I would resent, became a tool in my possession. The empty corridors echoed with the absence of authority, yet the presence of opportunity. The brass key in my hand wasn't just a key, it was a symbol, a tangible representation of control over the empire they thought they had secured. As I stood in the foyer watching the last taillights disappear around the bend, anticipation coursed through me, steady and electric. The chaos they left behind, the false sense of dominance, and the oblivious confidence of their departure were all elements I would now turn to my advantage. The house wasn't a prison, it was a command center, and for the first time I had the freedom to act with precision, patience, and calculated intent, knowing that the stage was set for the audit that would finally expose the truths they had worked so hard to conceal. The moment the limousine disappeared beyond the iron gates, the house fell into a silence I had never heard before. For years it had been a place of commands, footsteps slammed doors, and quiet obedience. Now it felt different, empty, still, waiting. I locked the front door behind me and walked straight to my father's study, the brass key cool in my hand, like a promise finally being fulfilled. The filing cabinet sat exactly where it always had, tucked beside his desk, like a guarded vault. For years, I had been told not to touch it without supervision. For years, I had pretended not to notice. Now, I slid the brass key into the lock and turned it slowly. The click echoed through the room, louder than it should have been. It sounded like the beginning of something irreversible. I started with the computer. My father believed passwords were a formality, something meant to discourage outsiders not family. His login took exactly one guess. Richard won. Arrogance makes people predictable. The desktop opened, filled with tidy folders labeled for auditors, contractors, and vendors. Most of it was theater documents designed to look legitimate if anyone ever glanced quickly. I ignored those immediately and moved straight to the partition I knew existed but had never touched before. Hidden partitions aren't invisible if you know where to look. Within seconds, I was inside it. The shadow ledger appeared on screen. 5 years of fraud unfolded in front of me like a map. Double-booked expenses, ghost employees, construction materials billed to projects that didn't exist, transfers moving through shell companies like water through pipes. It was meticulous but not perfect. Fraud never is. One folder caught my attention immediately: Board Retreat, Hawaii. I opened it and leaned back in my chair, almost laughing. The entire vacation, first-class flights, beachfront villas, private chefs, luxury excursions had been filed as a corporate seminar. Corporate funds paying for Britney's bikini photos and Tyler's hangovers. Tax fraud so blatant it practically introduced itself. I didn't linger. Reading wasn't the goal anymore. Preservation was. I reached into my bag and pulled out a black, encrypted hard drive I had purchased months earlier, long before this moment arrived. I connected it to the computer and began a mirror copy of the entire system. Emails, ledgers, invoices, payroll records, offshore transfers. Everything moved slowly across the screen as the progress bar crept forward. While the files transferred, I turned to the physical evidence. The filing cabinet opened smoothly. Inside were neatly labeled folders containing the hard copies my father trusted more than digital records. Original deeds, signed tax documents, printouts from internal payroll systems, correspondence about shell companies. The IRS notices he had tossed at me earlier were already here, waiting to become evidence. I worked quietly and carefully, placing the most incriminating documents into a waterproof banker's bag I had brought with me. Every paper was chosen deliberately. Every page was another nail in the coffin. The progress bar finally reached 100%. I removed the drive and slipped it into the protective case. Years of lies now lived inside a device smaller than my hand. Then I began erasing my presence. I wiped the keyboard with a microfiber cloth, the mouse, the desk surface, even the filing cabinet handles. Every place my fingerprints might have touched disappeared under careful strokes. I wasn't panicking. I wasn't rushing. Precision mattered now more than ever. When I stepped out into the kitchen, the binder Brittany had shoved into my arms still sat on the marble island. Pages of dog schedules and humidifier instructions stared back at me like relics from another life. I placed the brass cabinet key on top of the binder and pulled out a yellow sticky note. 4 words. Consider this my resignation. I stuck it to the cover and closed the binder gently. For 5 years, this house had felt like a cage built from obligation and fear. Now it felt different. Not a prison, a crime scene. And for the first time, I wasn't the one trapped inside it. 2 days after I walked into the terminal with the encrypted hard drive, the world shifted in ways I had meticulously planned but never dared imagine. My father and Tyler arrived at my Aunt Teresa's gallery in San Francisco, confident linen shirts still damp with sweat from sunburn, expecting confrontation or perhaps compliance. They were met instead by stunned faces, hushed whispers, and the presence of federal authorities who had already received everything I had collected. Private security and threats meant nothing when weighed against documented evidence in the hands of the IRS and FBI. Within hours, arrests were made. My father and Tyler were taken into custody, their empire frozen mid-collapse assets, seized houses, emptied accounts locked, and funds impounded. The grandeur they had wielded so carelessly evaporated in the cold efficiency of justice. I stood among the chaos, not as a victim, not as a dependent, but as a recognized whistleblower whose diligence and courage had shifted the balance entirely. Through the whistleblower program, I received a financial reward that reflected the magnitude of what I had uncovered: $3.6 million, a tangible validation of years spent silently building, observing, and documenting. The life I had once led, quiet, hidden, defined by servitude, was replaced with independence, choice, and recognition. Aunt Teresa welcomed me into her inner circle not as her niece, but as a financial consultant whose insight and acumen were finally visible and valued. The silk gown I wore at the gallery, the glass of vintage champagne in my hand, and the admiration of peers and clients were affirmations that the person I had been in the shadows had been underestimated entirely. Meanwhile, my family's collapse was undeniable. The power they had flaunted, the arrogance they relied upon, crumbled beneath their own actions. What they had assumed was loyalty and submission was in truth expertise and quiet defiance. The Lexus, the villas, the meticulously curated facades of wealth all vanished or were frozen, leaving them stripped of authority, influence, and security. The very tools they used to maintain dominance had been used against them, turning their world inside out. As I walked through spaces once dominated by fear and expectation, I understood the true lesson of those years. Family isn't merely blood. It's the people who honor your integrity, who see your worth beyond appearances, and who support you in the work and choices that define your life. The parents who belittled and manipulated the siblings who ignored and scorned, they were lessons, not anchors. True family is found in those who recognize effort, protect dignity, and allow growth. In reclaiming my life, my work, and my future, I realized that respect, support, and trust are far more enduring than legacy, wealth, or name. I was no longer a shadow. I was fully present, fully empowered, and fully myself. From humiliation at a family dinner to reclaiming control over an empire built on deceit, this story shows how resilience, strategy, and patience can transform even the darkest situations. The narrator's journey from shadow CFO to empowered whistleblower is a reminder that power often lies where it's least expected. If this tale of cunning, courage, and triumph resonated with you, stay connected. There's more to uncover and lessons to learn from those who turn adversity into strength.